In Service to Love, the relationship podcast that helps you create more love in the practical day-to-day, centering connection in the life of the modern family with your host, therapist, mother, and artist, Randé Dorn. Hello. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. This is the In Service to Love podcast. My name is Randé Dorn, and I have a really special guest today. Her name is Michelle Vogel, and she is an MFT, another marriage and family therapist. And I'll say more about what she's kind of specializing in or moving towards. But what I wanted to share is that we met. Michelle was one of the people that I was supervising for a while, probably, was it a year? Maybe a little bit more than a year?
I think it was slightly over a year.
Yeah. And she's amazing. And even if I say I was supervising her, let me remind everybody, it takes like 3,000 hours for us to get to the place of being licensed. And so, Michelle was like well on her way, continues to be brilliant and a genius at this work. So me supervising just meant, making sure that she was able to count her hours, So again, I'm saying that because I really want to emphasize her expertise in our conversation and her expertise in her work. And I want to do that because I want to make sure that her practice continues to be filled with like amazing clients. So with that being said, welcome. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is that she shared with me at the top of our conversation today was that she's starting to move into this place of working on vulnerability, on working on pleasure within our lives as a clinician and love. And so I know her as someone who was had not more of a specialty, but was specializing in sex and sexuality and diverse partnerships. And so I'm going to let her speak right now, but I want to ask her what brought this change and where you want to emphasize your work.
Yeah. Thank you, Randé. Thank you for that intro. Very generous. I know that my practice and my orientation and how I work has changed dramatically through your supervision. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity and continue to have a relationship with you. It's been good. But yeah, good question. I feel like in the last year, kind of with not only within the pandemic, but kind of what feels now like a post-pandemic era, I've noticed not only like my own observations of sex positivity and consent culture, a real kind of interesting, nuanced experience that people are having that still encompasses a lack of pleasure in their sex lives. So they're like, I'm doing everything right. I'm doing the enthusiastic consent practice and I joined the club essentially. And why am I still having bad sex, or why does it still not feel satisfying? And so I was really curious about this, and I did a lot of research and reading, and so I was really happy to learn that I wasn't alone. There are a lot of academics and writers and feminists who are have brought this out, who are actively talking about it. And it's shifted my idea around wanting to specifically do sex therapy in my practice, and shifting into how to engage with clients in conversations around not necessarily the nitty-gritty bits of like what academics are talking about, but how to engage them in more nuance around why they're not having good sex. And there's a number of things. And so I feel like part of the overarching theme of what a lot of academics and feminists are talking about currently is this lack of vulnerability in the conversations around consent and sex positivity. So it's like this like mechanical, very orthopedic way of having sex, which has its merits. And I think that there's a lot of like harm reduction practices done there, which are good. But that there's also a sense of like people just feeling pretty deflated.
Yeah.
And so I want to help people get their groove back,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
In that way.
Yeah.
Um, and and especially, a little bit of how we were talking about earlier in this post kind of COVID world where people are like, I'm ready to live life again. I had a
Mhm.
sense of like how much we take for granted, how
Mhm.
time is short, and so how do I bring pleasure back into
Right.
my life?
Right. Tell me more about this idea of vulnerability within exactly what you said. And I'm closing my eyes because I'm trying to articulate the words that I'm looking for, because I think I'm what I'm hearing, or maybe what I gathered with this idea of like potentially people kind of behaving in a sexual
Mhm.
manner, even behaving consent. But
Mhm.
when I
Mhm.
think about vulnerability, it's an energetic, right? It's coming to a place of allowing and potential surrender.
Mhm.
But so
Mhm.
how do you bring clients to that place, or even start to have that conversation?
Yeah, I think the thing also what I notice and what a lot of people talk about is how consent has placed the burden on women
Mm.
to be responsible for their own safety.
Mhm.
And so sadly, in a way, women are coming to me and saying, um, like they're the ones who primarily come to me to talk about this, and
Mm.
men are not.
Okay.
And so, part of what when I do talk to men or my male clients, it's engaging them in the sense of like, what's your pleasure? What turns you
Mm.
on? What gets, a lot of times I just hear men say like, seeing her happy.
Yeah.
And that's not enough. And
Mhm.
so I think eliciting some sort of curiosity
Mhm.
for all genders, for everyone,
Yeah.
is a place to start with accessing some sort of vulnerability.
Yeah. What might be the first questions around curiosity? And I know I'm in some ways, even as I say that, I'm maybe again creating a list of behaviors, but
Yeah.
w- m- m- I guess what's the entry point potentially around curiosity, around mm, yeah, the trying to understand my pleasure and someone else's pleasure
Mhm.
within these particular settings.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, good question. I think the first thing that I tend to ask people is, do you want this?
Mm.
Do you want sex? Do you
Mhm.
want this type of experience?
Mm.
And it becomes very like almost assumed. It becomes
Mhm.
this thing that people feel like they have to do in order to have a successful relationship
Mhm.
or feel whole in the world or
Mhm.
feel liberated in some way.
Mhm.
But the truth is like I think hardly anyone has ever asked like, do you even want it? Like,
Mm.
is it interesting to you?
Mhm.
Right? What's interesting to you about it? What
Mhm.
sort of experiences or sensations do you like or don't like about it? So it's like really finite, um, again, nuanced questions that help people get curious about like, oh yeah, what is it about sex that I want and
Yeah.
don't want to?
Yeah. What are you finding in terms of those answers, or how people are approaching those questions?
Yeah, yeah. I'm finding again with these questions, I'm finding a very like difference in how men and women show up with
Mhm.
answering those questions. So with men, I do find it's a little bit of more like I have to slow things down to get them to a place to be actually curious about what it is that they themselves enjoy about sex or
Mm.
want through sex.
Mhm.
Whereas with women, I am finding that it's like, well, I should because I'm in a relationship, or I
Mhm.
should because I want a relationship.
Mm.
So I remember I had a consultation with someone who came to me because she was finding herself in like very low to like non existent sexual response.
Mhm.
And when I did ask her that question of like, do you even want it? It felt very like she was almost like, of course,
Mm.
like because I want a relationship.
Mm.
And and interestingly enough, she didn't appreciate that I had asked her that because she felt unseen or unheard by me in that there's no way to separate her lack of sexual desire and having a successful relationship.
Right.
Like she had to be a sexual being in order to have a healthy
Right.
relationship.
What would be the alternative?
The alternative would be someone who's like Yeah, I'm noticing myself in sexual experiences where I can't like concentrate, or I'm like I'm not there, but I know that I want it, right? Just a little bit of knowledge of like, or curiosity of like, I do want to have sex.
Mhm.
I'm attracted to my partner, or I have multiple partners that I'm attracted to that I want to have sex with, or I just want to be a sexual subject, right? A sexual being in the world.
Mhm.
And um that would be an understanding of like themselves as being sexual and wanting it, versus
Mm.
someone who who conflates the idea that in order to be happy you have to have sex,
Mm.
right? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm 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 curious, like my mind's going a couple different directions. One, well, maybe my first question is like, what, like how do you see the importance potentially of being a sexual being
Mhm.
or being
Mhm.
sexual within a relationship? Like,
Mhm.
is there, I hate to say it, hierarchy, but like, yeah, like where do you kind of place that? I guess because as you're saying, in some ways, maybe even separating the two, I don't have to necessarily be sexual to be in a successful relationship.
Mhm.
But then what does sexuality maybe add to, or yeah, like how, like I guess I'm trying to like place it someplace. Like where are you
Mhm.
potentially placing it
Mhm.
in, maybe even within the conversation or within a relationship?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to almost not over determine it,
Mm,
right? Like,
mhm.
not have it be the sole thing that's going to bring you joy and happiness and
Of
pleasure.
course. Yeah.
So I think that that's where I'm coming from. And I think that that's what
Mhm.
threw that potential client off, was this like, but there's no way I can't, like, there's no way they have to coexist.
Right.
Right. And so for a lot of people, and I think that this is true of a lot of things that we tend to do as humans, is like put things on
Mm.
pedestals or
Mm.
overdetermine, or just like really, really overly um value
Mhm.
something that is actually really complicated to navigate, really like
Mhm.
like difficult to hold. Like, it's you can't really hold it. And so we can explore it and have experiences with it. And there are ways to do that successfully, but without
Mhm.
it being the sole, like, one and only thing that's going to make you feel connected to your partner, or
Mhm.
whole as a person, or even
Right.
liberated, to be
Right.
honest.
Yeah.
Mhm,
That makes sense.
mhm,
I mean, as I'm listening, I'm, like you said, like not putting it on a pedestal and not necessarily making it way more than something else. Like
mhm.
when I'm talking to clients, I guess my approach, it's a different language, but this idea of kind of broadening
Yeah.
even the idea of it, right? Like it isn't
Mhm,
just
mhm,
penetration or even masturbation, that it's like
mhm,
sex can be a lot of things,
mhm,
right? A lot of
mhm, mhm,
play, a lot of, moments
mhm,
of connection, that
mhm,
sex can even start way before,
mhm,
the quote unquote act
mhm.
of sex, and
Yeah,
in some ways what I encourage clients is to start early, right? That a lot of the playfulness or the flirting can start typically days
mhm,
before, right? The
mhm,
anticipation
mhm,
of it.
mhm,
And at the same time, I think to your point, especially as sexual, the act of sex or sexual relation or the act of penetration, you know, ebbs and flows within
mhm,
relationships, that,
mhm.
can we potentially use that as the determinant whether or not this relationship is healthy or
Right,
whole?
right. Mhm,
I do say to clients at the same time around monogamy, that if you're in a monogamous relationship, but I believe that there's a requirement for sex, in the sense of we've decided that we are the only sexual partners with each other.
mhm.
And as I say that, that also means that is a conversation as to what that actually looks like, right? That we
Yes.
can broaden it. Doesn't mean therefore we have
Mhm,
to have sex once a week, once a day, whatever, or
mhm,
that it even has to include penetration on some
mhm,
level.
mhm, mhm,
But that if you're in some ways my only source,
mhm.
then you're my only source, and therefore what does that look like between the two of us? So I say that out loud to get your perspective on that, but also your perspective on potentially what it might mean for relationships who want to open it because maybe they're not a match in that way. And maybe, as you're saying, if I don't put it on a pedestal, but as just something that is a need that for one of us needs to be met. How do you see that, or how do we navigate something like that?
Yeah, good question. I think going back to, couples, I'd rather have couples agree to what level or what sex means to them, like you said, right? Like couples can agree that if we're going to be in a monogamous relationship, what our sex life will look like can be cuddles, could be tickles, could be massages, I think that like through the lifespan, desire changes. And so I have um, a client who's been in a 30-year marriage who now they don't have any sort of like what we would call conventional sexual contact, but that they're extremely intimate and playful with each other, and they are good like tag team, they're good parents. And so that I would want people to check in on whether that feels fulfilling to them, right? Rather than trying to check a box off of like, oh, because we're in a monogamous relationship, we have to have sex.
Right.
But the part around like folks who do, right? Let's say couples who do very much actively say like, this is important to us, sex is important to us, and we want to explore other versions, or maybe there's a needs met kind of situation.
Right.
Then the navigating that through just a lot of conversation, right? Really, truly understanding what it is that's important to you and your why. Like that's the number one question that I ask couples or people who are like, I want to open up my relationship. And it's like, what's your why?
Yeah. I mean, what are you finding in terms of the answer to that?
A lot of blank stares. I'm like, because I read it in, a book, or I got my friends are all doing it, or it's in the movies now. Like, it's just, we're culturally infused also with a lot of representations of non-monogamy that I think people are curious about, which is great.
Right.
But without a true understanding of what is meaningful to them.
Yeah.
Around that.
Do you think they need to have a sense of their own sexuality before they move into that, or that they can figure that out as they move into that? Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah. I think I'm a big fan of telling folks that two things can happen at the same time, right? That you don't have to know precisely, finite, like have on a list for sure what your sexuality is or what you're interested in before exploring. But I think just answering the question of, again, what your why is as a baseline, as like just a guidance to, what do I want around sex with another person, right? What structure of non-monogamy do I want, right? Like there's so much to navigate and consider around non-monogamy, and let alone what we consider polyamory too, right? So sometimes it is about sex and sometimes it isn't. And so having a distinction, I think, is important too.
What are you finding when it's not necessarily about sex? I think maybe that's something that we don't hear enough about.
Yeah, when it's not strictly sexual, I'm hearing more it's around like support. Like how do I build community?
Right.
And some folks think that, if I have this, what's termed kitchen table poly, right, where all my partners and all my partners' partners come together and we have a potluck every Sunday, we get along, that's the desire. The desire becomes wanting to build like family. Again, going back to not wanting to overdetermine anything, I don't believe that that's the only way to build community and to build your chosen family. But that sometimes folks think that it is.
Meaning that in some ways, in order to build that type of community that includes a deeper level of intimacy, we're going back to the idea that sex has to be included.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do we do that without sex being included, if that's a desire? And I'm asking that question because I know I have many clients who are like, I don't have enough friends.
Right, exactly.
Right. And I'm seeing that because many people, I think I've shared this before, are coming to LA like from a different location. And so they don't necessarily have a lot of support or family here. I think, that many of them think intimacy, partnership, and therefore connection, and therefore love, right? And so again, sex is typically included in that. But are there other ways that you're seeing or noticing, or even seeing your clients kind of build community that if they desire for sex not to be included in this? I mean, I can envision what you're saying, right? Like all these wonderful people around a kitchen table talking about all the things, and like, who doesn't want that, right? Like that, that image. And yet that idea of like, do I have to have sex in order to build that? Right. Or even as you're saying, within partnership.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, but what are your thoughts on that?
I have a client who's in a relationship and they're navigating their non-monogamy right now. One definitely wants kitchen table and wants to have sex with everyone at the table, and the other's like, I just want buds. Like I just want all people I can like hang out with and be chill, but I don't know about having sex with all of them. And so that goes back to the question of your why, right? Like that you don't have to give up, camaraderie and platonic intimacy, and think that sex is required in poly. And so for a lot of people will kind of claim being poly and not have sex, but wanting that deeper sense of community and intimacy. But I think that people get confused, like not confused, or rather think that they have to, right? It becomes some sort of requirement. If people know for certain, right, the why is like, yes, because I want to have all different types of sex with different people, then that's great. And that requires a lot of negotiation, a lot of conversation, a lot of risk management, all of that. And so, and for the person who doesn't, it's like, how do you collaborate? And I would rather have them collaborate on something that works for both of them, that can feel satisfying in that way. So I guess I would hate for anyone to feel that it would be like a narrow view of community building if it was only through the lens of polyamory or ethical non-monogamy. I think like we can expand it a little bit more.
Yeah. Are there, even kind of opening questions? You mentioned the why, but are there a couple of other opening questions that one can ask themselves? Because I mean, you're speaking to the complexity of these conversations, and in some ways there are people, I'll see this on the apps, right? Ethically non-monogamous, and at the same time, it's like I question that everyone knows what that really means, right? Is it just giving themselves kind of permission up front to say, I'm in a relationship, but I want to have sex with other people, and whether I've really had a deeper conversation with my current person or not, and what conversations does that mean with the person that they're trying to date? Are there questions that maybe we can start to ask ourselves on top of the why? If the why is like, yes, because I'd love to have multiple partners, because that's something I definitely want to explore. Are there, what maybe the next question number 2 or question number 3?
Yeah. I guess I try to encourage people to engage with questions, especially, you brought up the apps, because that's a notorious place for a lot of like hierarchy, or this sense of like judgment for like, I only want experienced poly people, right? No newbies. Like it becomes this like very, very toxic space for people who maybe are new, but do have a good sense of what they want, right? And they suddenly become excluded by people who have been practicing for, whatever they think is enough time to exclude others.
Right.
But whatever that is.
Oh my God. That's a great sentence.
and so I encourage people to engage with other people, especially if they're trying to find other partners through the apps, is to ask them questions around like what they find important around why they're doing non-monogamy. Right? So again, a lot of questions. It's just like conversation after conversation, which I think people don't realize how much is required.
Yes.
When they consider opening up.
Yes.
You're mostly talking.
Right.
You're having sex 10% of the time and 95% you're talking.
Yes. I mean, it's such a great point. I think there's a lot of people who don't realize that. In some ways, they think, oh, if I open it, it will allow for me to not have some of these conversations, these uncomfortable ones, these ones that where I'm just feel like I'm nagging or being nagged. And if we open it up, then all of a sudden, hallelujah, freedom. Around stuff. And that's not the case, right? Like there's actually, going back to beginning, a lot of vulnerability around these conversations, right? This idea of being available and raw, that like, what does love look like? And that I heard a podcast years ago around this topic. And what stood out to me, something they said, was around like primary relationships versus maybe secondary, and this idea of one, whoever potentially this third, let's just say a third person coming in, it's like they're still a person. They're not there for you to just kind of use for your sexual pleasure. And they framed it in a way that was really helpful for me in terms of like your deep friendships, right? Going back to, it's like we may quote unquote have our best friends, but we also have a community of other friends, and we may be inviting this friend here or that friend there. And what does it mean to navigate sharing our life with someone? And this idea of like, well, you're not my best friend, and therefore what, I exclude you from things, or I don't treat you a particular way, or you're just a toy that I use. We would never do that within friendships, but somehow we're able to frame potentially a third person in that way. And so it helped for me to get a sense of like, oh, when we sometimes use the terms in terms of primary, that sometimes we're using it, again, going back to that, I'm going to exclude someone, or I'm going to relate to them not as a full person. And so what does it mean, to, if I'm going to move in this direction, you're moving in this direction with full human beings who deserve and require,
absolutely,
a certain level of treatment. So back to, I know I have a bunch of questions. Well, let me go to some of those questions. One of them.
They're good questions.
And we touched a little bit on it, but like one of them is like, what is good sex? And what should we expect from good sex?
Ooh, the $1 million question.
I went right for the good one.
That was the one. That was the one that stumped me. What is good sex, and what should we expect? We talk so much about knowing what bad sex is, right? That we lose sight of like, what is our own pleasure? And because we live in a world that makes mostly women responsible for their own safety, it becomes then this like double standard of like, be super scared of the world, but then once you're of a sexual age, be super confident and know what you want. And so of course it's confusing, and of course women are having bad sex.
Yes.
It's a recipe for just disaster.
Right.
So for good sex is, in my opinion, and what I try to help people understand is like, what do you know you like? Let's start with the self, right? So I really encourage people to engage in solo sex practices for a while before kind of I mean, again, they can do two things at the same time if they're partnered or if they want to have partnered sex also.
Right.
But paying attention to the difference of those experiences.
Right.
Like, what is it like when you engage in a solo sex act versus a partnered sex act?
Right.
What do you like? What don't you like? What do you prefer? What don't you prefer? What sorts of things, like sensations, and what have you learned? Right. And
Right.
so, good sex is subjective, but I think it starts from understanding what feels good.
Right.
And what pleasure is. It's
Right.
like, how do you define pleasure for yourself?
Right. Is there a way, like, I guess what I'm curious about is like, where do I start to get that information? Not just from my own body, but, should I be reading particular books? Should I be watching particular things? Because I think it's like it's hard sometimes to access what you don't know, right? And how to explore that. I mean, I'll be transparent that I mean, when I was in college, I was in my second college, so I was at Cal Arts, and one of my good friends like finally took me to go buy a vibrator, but I was like in my 20s when that happened. I wasn't really, really sexually active until I met my husband, basically. So I was mid 20s, I think, was around that time. So there was a lot, and I did some exploring, but there was a lot that that I didn't know. And I remember when I first started becoming sexually active with my husband or partner or whatever, boyfriend at the time, but I was like bought a bunch of books, like
yeah, sure,
right,
yeah.
And so like what was funny enough at Cal Arts, porn was available. Like it was, I mean, you could watch it, at the cafeteria. They were just so crazy over there. But right, but even as I say that, I know now things are even more hardcore, right? In some ways, right? Like the porn industry is tapping into all kinds of things that maybe can give us some information, but sometimes can give us really bad information, right?
Totally.
And not everybody has that friend who's like, okay, girl, like you need to, right? Like holds your hand and takes you to the sex shop. Like, wow, like I, was like so grateful to have, right?
Of course.
So how do people start to both and in some ways access themselves, but be inspired? Maybe that's what I'm looking for. Like, what can I access where I can start to be inspired as to what is actually available within my own body to do, and what pleasure is available for me?
Yeah, good question. I think that starting with like there's a real almost like before going out, right? Before buying the book, before buying the sex toy, before watching the porn, like there's maybe a conversation to be had, and that I would encourage it therapeutically, of course, but just a conversation of like, when you think of sex, what does that feel like in your body? Like, what comes up for you, right? And I'd be curious in like just having a conversation with someone around that as the entry point to what does it elicit within you?
Yeah.
Right. What comes up to help steer an idea of like, okay, there's tons of literature, there's tons of images, we are a sex like crazed culture.
Yeah.
And massively repressed at the same time.
Yes.
Right?
Such extremes.
Yeah. But we can't navigate that field without having just a sense of like, sex feels, I feel ambivalent about it, or it feels scary to me, or it feels exciting, or I feel a lot of shame, right? Like that's really important to locate first before we go out and consume the media essentially that's out there.
Yeah.
But I do have tons of advice around that I help people like, okay, so now we have a good sense of what comes up for you when you think about sex. How to engage with what's out there with a critical lens, right? So porn isn't real. It's useful. I think it's a great tool, but it's not real.
Yeah.
Sex toys are great, but they can be limiting for
Mhm.
people with ability issues or
Mhm.
socioeconomic statuses or the
Mhm.
home life, right? Like
Mhm.
it's not always the thing that people have access to. Um, and literature, same, right? There's also accessibility in there too.
Mhm.
And a lot of the literature around like sex advice tends to be very like, you must have it.
Mm.
So there is a book that I do like, that I do recommend people, and it's available also in like audiobook, so it's accessible. That's called Enjoy Sex,
Mhm.
and it's written by two British academic kind of sex scholars, and it's like this slow moving exploration of like what is, again, the question of like what is sex elicit in you, but also what
Mhm.
counts as sex
Mhm.
for you.
Mm.
How do you explore that?
Right.
So it's, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, it gets us closer.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
The one of the questions I had, that we spoke about just briefly before we jumped on this podcast was, around, I was sharing that what was coming up in my practice was this idea of wanting to feel desired, and that
Mhm,
being
mhm,
feeling important to the sense of connection
mhm,
within the relationship. And so
mhm,
I'm bringing that up, in connection to this idea of one, what is good sex, but also the self exploration
mhm,
of
mhm,
good sex.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so I'm wondering if this idea of feeling desired, is that something that we have to solve internally? Is that
mhm,
something
mhm.
that we have agency over in terms of
Yeah.
creating within a partnership, or is that
Mhm.
something that we really are waiting to experience from someone else?
Right, right. Yeah. I think a little kind of from closing the circle from the last question
Mhm.
around like how to begin to feel desired. A lot of us don't feel desired because we don't see images of ourselves as desirable,
Ooh. Mhm.
right?
I'm like, say more. That's a quote.
And so part of it is like stop following people on social media who don't look like you,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
Like if our image of sexy is some tall skinny white lady,
Mhm.
sorry,
Yeah.
that's, then of course I'm going to hate myself. I'm going to find myself
Yeah.
undesirable.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one thing, right? Like again, that's that critical lens that I was talking about. Like
Mhm.
I would rather have people view sexual content through that critique.
Mhm.
And so it starts that's one way to start kind of like shifting our lens of desirability.
Mhm.
Um, because to be honest, what we see as desirable in the world is the manifestation of a cishet white man.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's the desire that becomes kind of real. That's what gets fed back.
Right. Right. And whatever that desire is, in the season, right?
Exactly.
Sometimes it's a big ass, and sometimes it's a
Mhm.
skinny waist, and
Yeah.
sometimes it's, porn, and sometimes
Yeah.
it's wealth. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. No, there's tons that gets infused in that. So of course it's hard to access like if I don't look like that or if I don't have that or if I don't perform in that way, that
Mhm.
makes me undesirable.
Mhm.
Um so seeking out things again, porn is a good tool for that. There's lots of like, tons of alternative, I guess, for lack of a better word, but that's like made by queer people, made by people of color, made by
Mhm.
trans folks, made by feminists, right? Like that porn has more variability.
Yeah.
And so it offers like more to the imagination
Mm.
and more to play with there.
Right.
Again, it's still not real. So I want
Yeah.
to like,
Yeah.
I can't help but like really remind folks that it's still a production at the end of the day, and it's still
Sure.
something that's trying to be sold, right? It's still
Right.
under capitalism.
Yes.
um, but it can be useful to inspire and to like kind of get the juices flowing.
Mhm.
Um, as far as like desirability and just desire, I think it's also extremely contextual.
Mm.
So how what's your home life like, right? What's your work-life balance? What's your self-care practice? How does your partner treat you?
Right.
Like all of that will definitely play into whether someone feels desire, period.
Right.
Um, whether finding themselves desirable or wanting to engage like in sex,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I imagine like the busyness of life, and
Mhm.
then wanting to have this other experience that I think sometimes when I hear it, it feels like an extreme experience, right? Of
Mhm.
feeling like longed for in a certain
Mhm.
way. Like I want to feel
Mhm.
desired, meaning like
Mhm.
I want maybe to feel like this distance between you and me, and that you want to close the
Mhm.
distance. I want to feel chased, right? I
Mm.
want to feel
Mm.
as if you're like
Mhm.
hungry for me.
Mhm. Mhm.
And well, how do we create that if I have laundry and two kids
Yeah.
hanging off of me?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are there things that you potentially talk about, or advice that you give around how to create even more space for that experience to maybe start to show up? Like, where
Mm.
do you tap into? Well, what's the lifestyle and the like?
Yeah. I feel like that's a good one for couples
Hmm.
because I think that I again it a lot of a lot of what we're talking about and a lot of what feels like advice kind of falls on women to be
Hmm.
responsible for.
Hmm.
And so I think men want to feel desired too. I think
Hmm.
that that's important to them too. Whether they talk about it openly or not is different. But having men engage in the conversation of like, how can you help? Right? How
Yeah.
can you engage with your partner in ways so that, and this is kind of prefacing this is a heterosexual context, right?
Sure.
Um, how do you engage in the relationship that can make space for desirability for the two of you,
Mm.
so that both of you feel pretty like desired, knowing that the context will influence whether you feel in the mood or not.
Hmm.
Um, and so even a lot of people push back on this suggestion, but it's so basic and it's not even, like I did not invent this, but like scheduling your sex,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I get
Yeah.
pushback all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm like, that's unsexy. And then they try it and that was great.
Yeah.
And like,
Wait, what?
just put it on the calendar
Hmm.
right now.
Yeah.
And there's something about knowing that something will happen, and there's
Hmm.
almost an anticipation that can be built,
Yeah.
which helps with women's kind of arousal response,
Hmm.
when you put it on the calendar. Like,
Right.
suddenly all the laundry gets done,
Hmm.
suddenly the kids go to bed early, right? Like, there's all these other things that happen when you prioritize
Right.
sex,
Yeah.
if that's what you want to do, right? If
Right.
that's important to you.
Sure. Sure.
So, I don't know if that answers a question on desire. Desirability is hard because I think
Yeah.
that going back to how someone has access to their desire, there's so much at play.
Hmm.
There's gender differences, there's power, there's allowing especially women to not know too. Like,
What do you
it's
mean? Not know.
not know what their desire is in
Mm.
that moment,
Hmm.
right? I think part of the pushback on the sex positivity movement was that women are going to emerge fully um, armed with knowledge of what they want at all
Hmm.
times, and so that's not true.
Right.
And leaving space for partners to talk about that ambiguity, right? Like,
Hmm.
right now, I don't know. I know I want something, but I don't know what it is. Let's
Sure.
let's explore and let's stay in dialogue around this exploration.
Right. Right. Well, and you brought up something earlier, right? This idea that we're repressed for so long, especially young girls, women, and then all of a sudden we're supposed to just know what we
Mm,
want when
mhm,
we may have been told not to touch our own bodies,
mhm,
or not even have
mhm,
access to
mhm,
the
mhm,
concepts of that I could be in pleasure within my
mhm.
body. We've
Absolutely.
been, wronged for feeling pleasure when we were
Mhm,
kids. Because I mean,
mhm,
it's not like our as sexual beings that starts when we're infants,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And so then we get to this place where we're in our teens or 20s, and then we're just supposed to know. And I think as you're saying, that kind of ambiguity of like, well, how do I know what feels good when I haven't touched myself or been touched in that way? When someone may be asking, if they do ask, what do you want? What do you like? And I think in some ways the counter to that is that then if someone potentially, and I'll talk about men in this moment, is having sex with someone who doesn't know necessarily what they want, but then has a variety of those experiences, well, they could say, I've had 100 women, but it doesn't mean you actually know what good sex is either.
Yes, good point.
If you're having sex with people who can't share with you, who are in some ways numb or turned off from their own body, and you're not in conversation, right? So we're all kind of suffering.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. I think men get the short end of the stick as well with this, right? Like this is everyone is failed by this notion, by sex positivity, because it leaves out exactly what you said, right? Like this sense of like men just need to check the box off, like she said yes, we're good to go, without the nuance of like sex consent is ongoing and things can change and desires change, and that consistent dialogue is required in that process. And that although you have consent, you can still have bad sex. Right? That's not, you're not guaranteed good sex because there's consent.
Note to self.
But that's not in the language of consent culture or sex positivity, unfortunately. And so the backlash is that women are then forced to claim it as some sort of like assault almost, right? Not that that doesn't happen, it absolutely does.
Yes.
But that if there was consent and it was bad, then somehow that became assaultive or drew the line. And so everyone fails, right? Everyone fails in that context.
Yeah.
And for men especially, because there's zero conversation around being curious about their own pleasures and what they would like and what the quality of these sexual encounters are like for them. It's like, sure, you have, a list of 100 people that you've slept with. How was it?
Right.
Right. How was that for you?
Right. Right. And what was the connection, even if any? And, sometimes it ends up being kind of a numbers game, and maybe it's numbers because they're also seeking something. I watch sometimes some of these documentaries around young people now, right? Just kind of like free sex everywhere all the time. And it's like, well, what do you, maybe it's to the point of many of your questions, like, what are you looking for in having this drunken sex on a beach with some random person that you're never going to meet again? What does that do to, in some ways, the sacredness of your own body to have that type of energetic connection or lack of connection? To me, in some ways, there's a level of, I think, violation when we are coming together in this way where we're not really coming together, right? Where it's just friction, at the base level. And your body is left with that. Both bodies, right, are left with that. It's not a wounding because, like you said, there's a certain level of consent around it, but it's, I don't know, like it feels used in a way that I can't quite articulate, right? Yeah. But we're agreeing to it, I think, because we're searching for something. And again, maybe back to some of the other points that you made of we're searching for a certain level of connection that we think maybe we can get from sex, or we're looking for maybe a certain level of validation.
That too.
Right. Oh, if I sleep with this particular person, or that particular person, then maybe that'll give me a certain level of validation within my own, or worth even. What do you find within that, like potentially those conversations around, I want to go to like that maybe worth or beauty or again, maybe the disconnection of sex versus like you as a, like, I guess talking about desirable being in the world.
Yeah. Ooh, that one, that has the potential. again, this is all nuanced, right? Like this
Mhm.
is that's why I it's hard for me to take a position around that sex is has the potential to be liberatory
Mhm.
because so much gets infused into
Yeah.
it.
Mhm.
And so I would even want to be careful with not moralizing
Mm.
people's choices
Yeah.
around sex,
Yeah. Thank you for saying that.
right? And so it's like, yeah, if I want to get drunk and have drunken sex with a stranger, like that should be a decision that
Mhm.
I can make as an autonomous person
Mhm.
and not have that viewed by the world with this like judiciary process,
Mm.
right? Like,
Mhm.
because I think we all have these like little courtrooms in our mind. And
Yeah.
it's like we're constantly blaming women
Mm.
for their bad sex
Mm.
or for sex that they then themselves find to be unpleasurable.
Right.
Um, but it's tricky because it's also a question of like you said, like what gets you there in the first place? Like
Mhm.
what's the hope? What were you wanting?
Right.
And I think a lot of people mm, are wanting something that they may think they'll achieve through certain behaviors.
Mhm.
Versus, like I said, the autonomous choice of like, yeah, I'm going to go out and have sex with whoever, and that's okay. But sometimes it's not without the knowledge of that decision.
Mm.
That makes sense,
Yes.
right? Like, this is what I'm doing.
Right, being rooted and
Yeah,
intentional,
yeah.
even in that decision,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that the
Mm-hmm.
decision is still coming from a place of that would be fun or that would be
Yeah,
pleasurable.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think and thank you for everything you just said. I
Mm-hmm.
think as I was looking at it, the images that I have in my head, like I wasn't necessarily seeing some of those decisions coming necessarily from a place of pleasure.
Yeah, I know. Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
was I was seeing and the judgment in my own head, right? I was
Totally,
seeing them
totally.
from a place of not fun. Something
Yeah,
not
yeah,
fun
of course,
about
of
it, you know?
course.
And then at
Yeah.
the same time, it's like I'm also, one of the first, not one of the first, but I mean, like in conversations with clients, it's like, well, while you're looking for your person, maybe a
Mhm,
lover would be nice to have, right? Like
mhm,
maybe,
mhm,
dating a couple of people
mhm,
so that your anxiety isn't peaked because
mhm,
you think this
mhm,
one is the one
mhm,
and you've only had two dates,
mhm, mhm.
So like you said, the nuance of how we engage with our pleasure and how we engage with our sexuality and a lot of what you're saying is how do we root into our whys from
Mhm,
a place of just being, I guess, very solid and very clear,
mhm,
in our decisions
mhm,
so that we own them,
mhm,
at the same
mhm,
time, right? Like
exactly.
we're
Mhm.
however we're navigating
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is there, 'cause we're almost at time. Wow, it went by
Mm,
so
that
fast.
flew
But
by.
but is there a particular question or advice that you seem to give out often, or guidance? Maybe it's not advice,
Mm,
but guidance that you seem
mhm.
to give out often around sex or around this new direction that you're going around
Yeah.
vulnerability and love and pleasure.
Yeah, good question. Hmm. What's my theme? I feel like I've been yeah, I've more recently have been kind of in a space of helping facilitate just a curiosity
Mm-hmm.
for people within themselves to like, what is kindness and compassion feel like to you? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is that a value that you hold? And
Mm-hmm.
how do you make decisions on this value,
Mm-hmm.
including how you treat yourself,
Mm-hmm.
right? How you treat others, how you view sex, how you engage with sex, like how you talk to your partners around sex? Like,
Mm-hmm.
can we hold kindness and compassion as like the foundation
Mm.
for how we navigate all those
Yes,
things,
please.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Do
Mhm.
you find that there is the word elevation comes up, but like, do you find that turns the dial for your clients or for the people that?
I think like it's interesting because it's like everyone says like, oh, of course, right? Like, of
Mm.
course, that's a value that I have.
Mm-hmm.
But being asked it, I think
Mm-hmm.
directly in reflection to decisions or behaviors that they've engaged with, like, I'm the one reflecting back, like, well, when you behave like that, where was your kindness and compassion?
Right.
So it's useful to kind of remind them, if you
Yes.
will,
Yes.
that these are things that are important to them, so
Mm-hmm.
that we can all collectively live in a better
Mm-hmm.
world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like what you just said in terms of even kind of in the moment or even in reflection of something that has already a situation that's already happened.
Yes. Yes.
Where is my kindness and compassion, or where was it in my
Mhm.
behavior, in the decisions that I
Mhm.
made, and in decisions that I'm about to make or behavior that I'm about to do.
Mhm.
And that's when we can take that breath in
Mhm.
that moment and say, okay, can
Mhm.
I explore this? Can I engage
Mhm.
with this
Mhm.
from that place of
Mhm.
kindness? Can I infuse all of this from this place of
Mhm.
compassion? And
Mhm.
how can I see myself and whoever I'm engaging with
Yeah.
differently from
Exactly.
that place?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you
Yeah. Of
for
course.
reminding us of that
Of
and so
course.
many things that you shared today.
Mhm.
How can, as we're wrapping up, how can
Mhm.
people find you? How can people
How can
find your
people find me?
brilliance?
Yeah, I'm still like in hiding, in a way. I
Which
don't
is
know
why
why.
you're here.
Yeah.
Trying to make you not be in
I
hiding.
know. I appreciate that.
Well, no, and also, right, like I again, I just want to remind everyone, and myself included, that it's like I specifically asked you here because of the wealth of information and the way that you articulate that information
Thank you.
to people. So,
Thank
yes, I'm bringing
you.
you out of hiding, but also because I needed your intelligence and your genius
I appreciate that.
within this
Yeah,
conversation.
thank you, Randé, for doing that. I need more kind of I need to be pushed
Yeah.
sometimes in that direction. Yeah, right now I have a profile on Psychology Today.
Mm-hmm.
And so folks who want to work with me or who we do good work together are the
Mm-hmm.
folks who read fully, like
Mm-hmm.
my offerings and my positions and where I'm at
Mm-hmm.
and all of that. Folks who skim it and don't read it fully we may not jive, but
Right.
that's okay.
Note to self or
Yeah.
note to everyone else, please read everything.
Please read the profile. It's there for a reason.
Yes.
But I feel like the profile gives a good sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course I offer consultations,
Mhm.
20-minute, however long to chat, get a feel for each other, whether I can help, whether they feel I'd be a good fit for them and vice versa.
Mhm.
And and go from there. Yeah, my contact is all on Psychology Today, my phone
Mhm.
number, and there's an email, a
Mhm.
way to email me through there as well. But that's my primary
Yeah.
contact.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Good. Thank
yeah.
you. And again, as Michelle just said, because I was going to ask you your email, but actually I don't want to take it because I want everyone, as you have requested, for everyone to read the profile first and
Sure.
then
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
reach out.
yeah, yeah.
I know you don't have a ton of spaces left.
I don't, but I am interested in couples.
Mhm.
I have some spots for couples
Yeah.
or uh, non-monogamous folks who are either solo or partnered who want
Mhm.
to kind of have more process
Yeah.
around that.
Beautiful.
But for folks who listen to this, and I felt like I kind of gave a good sense of how I work just
Absolutely.
from our chat. But
Mhm.
so I'm happy to share my emails, Michelle Vogel,
Mhm.
therapy@gmail.com. And that is the most direct way to
Yeah.
contact me.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again for sharing yourself and your
Of course.
wisdom with us today. I've shared in other podcasts. I don't refer a lot of therapists because I'm so picky,
Yeah.
but you are one of the people that I absolutely 100%
Thank you.
refer. And I just honor our relationship and so grateful that you came into my life.
Likewise.
And that we continue to work together and to consult together. Again, even some of the things you said today, um, where it's like, oh, that's not necessarily how I'm thinking. And I'm grateful that you just again, like that you help to kind of keep my mind going and keep me questioning how I'm framing things in a way that continues to put kindness and compassion first, So thank you. All right, everyone. I will talk to you next week. You know where to find us. Sending everyone big love. All right. Thank you again, Michelle.
Thank you.
Yay. Thank you so much for listening. As always, please share, comment, and like so we can grow our community and bring more love to those you love. Great reviews mean a great deal to our work, so take a few minutes and write us a love letter today. Our hearts appreciate every word. Tune in next week for another episode.